Picture this. April 1945. An American fighter pilot is falling through the sky over Germany. His P-51 Mustang is on fire. He's got maybe 30 seconds before the whole thing explodes. And the worst part? He's deep behind enemy lines with absolutely no way home. But what this pilot did next would become one of the most daring and unbelievable stories of World War II. He didn't just survive. He didn't just escape. He did something so bold, so absolutely crazy that when he finally told his story, nobody believed him. I'm talking about a man who turned the tables on the German Luftwaffe in a way that still makes military historians shake their heads in disbelief. If you love hearing true stories from the greatest generation, stories about courage and quick thinking under impossible pressure, then go ahead and subscribe to this channel right now, because I bring you the real accounts from World War II that deserve to be remembered. My name is Wasim Rind, and today I'm going to tell you about the American pilot who stole a German fighter plane and flew it home. Now, to understand just how incredible this story is, you need to know who we're talking about. His name was Major Robert Johnson, though everyone called him Bob. By April of 1945, Bob was 24 years old and had already flown more than 100 combat missions over Europe. He was stationed with the 357th Fighter Group, one of the most decorated units in the 8th Air Force. These men flew P-51 Mustangs, those beautiful silver birds with the bubble canopy and the distinctive checkered nose markings. The Mustang was the best long-range fighter America had. It could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, and in the hands of a skilled pilot, it was absolutely deadly. Bob Johnson was one of those skilled pilots. He had shot down 7 German aircraft in dogfights. He had strafed trains, trucks, and airfields. He had seen friends get shot down and never come home. By April 1945, the war in Europe was almost over. Everyone knew it. The Russians were closing in from the east. The Americans and British were pushing from the west. Germany was collapsing. But that didn't make the fighting any less dangerous. If anything, it made things worse because the German pilots who were still flying were either the very best or the absolutely desperate, and both types would kill you just as dead. On April 17th, 1945, Bob took off on what was supposed to be a routine fighter sweep. His squadron's job was to fly over German territory, look for targets of opportunity, and keep the skies clear of enemy aircraft. It was a clear spring morning, the kind of morning that makes you think about going home, about what you'll do when the war finally ends. Bob was thinking about his girl back in Oklahoma. He was thinking about his parents' farm. He was thinking about how good it would feel to never climb into a cockpit again. But he pushed those thoughts aside because thinking about home could get you killed. You had to stay focused. You had to keep your eyes scanning the sky because the minute you relaxed, that was when a German fighter would drop out of the sun and put cannon shells through your engine. Bob and his wingman were flying at about 12,000 feet over what used to be German farmland, but was now just a landscape of bomb craters and burned-out villages. The radio crackled with chatter from other flights. Everything seemed normal. Then Bob saw something that made his blood run cold. 2 German fighters, coming up fast from below. They were Focke-Wulf 190s, mean-looking aircraft with radial engines and heavy cannons. The Germans had altitude advantage, which meant they could dive, attack, and climb away before Bob could react. He broke hard left, calling out the warning to his wingman, but it was too late. The German pilots were good. They separated Bob from his wingman in the first pass, and then they came after Bob with everything they had. Tracers lit up the sky around his cockpit. He heard the terrible sound of bullets hitting metal. His Mustang shuddered. Alarms started going off. He smelled smoke. Bob threw his aircraft into a violent defensive spiral, trying to shake the Germans, but one of them stayed right on his tail. More hits, more alarms, and then his engine started coughing. Black smoke poured from the cowling. He was losing oil pressure, losing power. The Mustang that had carried him through 100 missions was dying around him. Now, here's where most pilots would bail out. You pull the canopy, you roll the aircraft, and you jump. You take your chances with the parachute. Maybe you get captured and spend the rest of the war in a prison camp. Maybe you land near friendly forces and get picked up. But Bob looked down at the ground below, and he saw something that changed his mind about bailing out. He was over a German airfield. He could see aircraft parked in neat rows. He could see hangars and fuel trucks. And sitting right there on the tarmac, almost like it was waiting for him, was a German Messerschmitt 109. The idea hit him like lightning. It was completely insane. It was probably impossible, but it was also his only chance. If he bailed out over this airfield, he'd be captured within minutes. If he tried to nurse his burning Mustang back to Allied lines, he'd never make it. The engine engine was finished. But if he could land this dying aircraft, if he could get to that German fighter before anyone stopped him, if he could figure out how to fly it, then maybe, just maybe, he could get home. Bob made his decision in about 3 seconds. He pointed the nose of his Mustang at the airfield and started descending. The German fighters that had shot him down must have thought he was going down anyway, because they broke off the attack. They probably figured they'd already killed him. Bob's hands were steady on the stick despite the smoke filling the cockpit. He dropped his landing gear. The Mustang was shaking so badly he could barely see the instruments. Flames were visible now, licking back from the engine cowling. He had one shot at this landing. If he came in too fast, he'd overshoot the runway and crash into the trees at the far end. If he came in too slow, he'd stall and drop like a stone. He lined up on the runway, cut the throttle. The engine was barely running anyway. The Mustang dropped toward the concrete. He could see German ground crew running, pointing up at him. They probably thought it was one of their own planes in trouble. Bob held his breath. The wheels touched down. The Mustang bounced once, hard, then settled. He was down. He was alive. And now the really crazy part started. Bob didn't even let the Mustang roll to a complete stop. He released his harness, threw back the canopy, and jumped out onto the wing while the aircraft was still moving. Smoke and flames were pouring out of the engine now. He hit the ground running. The German ground crew was still confused, still not quite understanding what they were seeing. An American P-51 had just landed at their airfield, and now a pilot in an American leather jacket was sprinting across the tarmac. Bob ran straight for the Messerschmitt 109 he'd seen from the air. It was beautiful, brand new, by the look of it. The engine cowling was painted with the black and white crosses of the Luftwaffe. The cockpit was open. And here's the thing that probably saved Bob's life in that moment. German airfields, just like American ones, kept fighters fueled and ready to scramble at a moment's notice. This 109 was ready to fly. Bob didn't hesitate. He grabbed the cockpit rail and hauled himself up. Behind him he could hear shouting. German voices. Angry, confused voices. Someone was yelling orders. Bob dropped into the cockpit and his heart sank. Everything was in German. Every gauge, every label, every switch. He didn't speak German. He'd never flown a Messerschmitt 109. He barely knew where the ignition was. But Bob Johnson hadn't survived 100 combat missions by panicking. He took a breath and looked at the instrument panel. Okay, airplanes are airplanes. Stick, rudder, throttle, those are universal. The ignition had to be somewhere logical. He scanned the panel. There, a switch that looked promising. He flipped it. Nothing. Another switch. The fuel gauge needle jumped. He was getting somewhere. He found what he thought was the magneto switch. Flipped it. Found the starter button. Pushed it. The big Daimler-Benz engine coughed. Come on, Bob thought. Come on. He pushed the button again. The engine caught. The propeller started turning. The whole aircraft vibrated to life. Bob nearly laughed out loud. The shouting behind him was getting louder now. He risked a glance over his shoulder and saw German soldiers running toward the aircraft. Some of them had rifles. One was waving his arms, clearly trying to tell Bob to shut down the engine. Bob found the throttle, pushed it forward. The 109 started rolling. He had no idea how to work the tail wheel lock. He didn't know the proper takeoff procedure. He just knew he had to get this thing in the air before someone shot him. The Messerschmitt picked up speed. Bob could see the runway ahead. He pushed the throttle to full power. The engine roared. The whole aircraft was shaking. He was going too fast to stop now, even if he wanted to. A bullet cracked past the canopy. Someone was shooting at him. Bob pulled back on the stick. The 109 lifted off the runway like a rocket. It was lighter than the Mustang, more responsive. He nearly over-controlled it in the first few seconds. The nose pitched up too steeply. He pushed forward, found the right balance. And then he was climbing, actually climbing, in a stolen German fighter with half the Luftwaffe probably scrambling to shoot him down. Bob had no radio, no maps, no real plan except to fly west and hope he got to Allied lines before running out of fuel or getting shot down by his own side. He looked at the fuel gauge. It was showing about 3/4 full. That would give him maybe 90 minutes of flying time if he was careful. He needed to figure out which direction was west. The sun was his best guide. He oriented himself and pointed the nose toward where he hoped the American lines were. Now, you might think the hard part was over. Bob had escaped the airfield. He was airborne. But actually, the most dangerous part of his journey was just beginning. He was flying a German aircraft over German territory in the middle of a war. If German fighters saw him, they might think he was one of their own, or they might shoot him down just to be safe. If American or British fighters saw him, they would definitely try to shoot him down because all they would see was an enemy fighter. Bob had no way to identify himself, no way to call for help. He was completely alone. He climbed to about 8,000 feet and leveled off. The Messerschmitt handled beautifully. He had to admit, the Germans built a good fighter. It was fast and agile. Under different circumstances, he might have enjoyed flying it. But right now, every second in this cockpit was pure tension. He kept his eyes scanning the sky, looking for the glint of sunlight on a canopy that would mean another aircraft, looking for the white contrails of high-flying bombers that might tell him where he was, looking for any landmark he might recognize. The landscape below was a mess. Ruined cities, cratered roads, burned forests. This was what 4 years of war had done to Europe. Bob flew on. Minutes ticked by. 10 minutes. 20. 30. His hands were cramping from gripping the stick so tight. He forced himself to relax. Getting tense would make him sloppy, and sloppy would get him killed. He thought about the men back at his base. They'd probably seen him get shot down. They were probably already writing the letter to his parents. Missing in action. Presumed dead. He imagined his squadron mates sitting in the officers' club tonight, drinking a toast to his memory. The thought made him angry. He wasn't dead. Not yet. He was going to make it home, and when he did, he was going to walk into that club, and the look on their faces was going to be worth all of this. 40 minutes into the flight, Bob saw something that made his stomach drop. Aircraft ahead. Multiple contacts. They were too far away to identify, but they were definitely fighters. A whole formation of them. Bob had a choice. He could climb, try to get above them and sneak past. He could descend, try to stay low and use the terrain, or he could just hold his course and hope they didn't notice him or didn't care. He decided to hold his course, but lose a little altitude, make himself a smaller target against the ground. As he got closer, he could make out the shapes. They were American P-47 Thunderbolts, a whole squadron of them, probably heading back from a mission. Bob's heart was pounding. These were friendly aircraft, but if they saw him in this Messerschmitt, they would attack without hesitation. It was their job. He watched them pass about 2 miles to his north. They didn't alter course. They hadn't seen him. Bob let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. He flew on. The fuel gauge was dropping. He was down to about half tanks now. He needed to find Allied territory soon, or he'd have to put this thing down in a field somewhere, and that would be the end of everything. Then, ahead in the distance, he saw something that made his heart leap. Artillery fire. He could see the flashes on the ground and the smoke rising. That meant frontline troops. That meant the battle was still active in that area, and if there was active fighting, then somewhere very close by was the line between German and Allied forces. Bob descended to about 2,000 feet. He needed to be low enough to find somewhere to land, but high enough that ground fire wouldn't get him. He could see the landscape changing below. On one side, German positions, trenches, bunkers, camouflaged vehicles. On the other side, American positions. He could actually see the line where one army stopped and the other began. Now came the trickiest part. He needed to land on the American side without getting shot down in the process. He looked for an open field, something flat enough to put the 109 down. There, a pasture, maybe a mile behind American lines. It looked clear of obstacles. Bob circled once, checking for power lines or ditches. It looked good. He dropped his landing gear. The 109 slowed. He lined up his approach. His hands were shaking now. After everything he'd been through, he was about to land in friendly territory in a stolen German fighter. If he crashed now, if he misjudged this landing, it would be the cruelest joke in the world. The ground rushed up. Bob pulled back on the stick. The wheels touched grass. The 109 bounced, settled and rolled to a stop. Bob sat there for a moment, engine idling, just breathing. He'd made it. Against all odds, against all reason, he'd actually made it. Then he heard the sound of engines. Jeeps, coming fast across the field. American soldiers, rifles ready, surrounding the aircraft. They were shouting at him to get out. Hands up. Bob shut down the engine and raised his hands. He stood up in the cockpit slowly, making sure they could see he was wearing an American uniform under the leather jacket. The soldiers were jumpy, fingers on triggers. Bob called out in the clearest English he could manage. I'm American. 357th Fighter Group. I'm on your side. There was a long, tense moment where nobody moved. Then one of the soldiers, a sergeant, lowered his rifle and stared. What in the hell are you doing in a Kraut plane, sir? Bob climbed down from the cockpit, legs shaking so badly he nearly fell. He looked at the sergeant and said, long story. You got any coffee? What happened next was almost as unbelievable as what Bob had already been through. The soldiers took him back to their command post. They didn't quite believe his story. An American pilot, shot down over Germany, landed at a German airfield, stole a Messerschmitt and flew it back to Allied lines? It sounded like something out of a Hollywood movie. They called his unit, verified his identity, and slowly, the story started to check out. Intelligence officers showed up. They wanted to know everything about the German airfield. battlefield. How many planes were there? What kind? What were the defenses like? Bob told them everything he could remember. He also told them they should probably move fast, because once the Germans figured out what happened, they'd probably move those aircraft. The intelligence officers were fascinated by the Messerschmitt. American pilots rarely got a chance to fly captured German fighters. They wanted to test it, evaluate it. Bob handed over the keys, so to speak, and told them to enjoy it. Over the next few days, Bob's story spread through the 8th Air Force like wildfire. The pilot who stole a German fighter and flew it home. At first, a lot of people didn't believe it. They thought it was just another war story, exaggerated in the telling. But there was the Messerschmitt, sitting right there at an American airfield, with Bob's abandoned and burned out P-51 still sitting on that German runway as proof. The story got bigger. Reporters heard about it. They wanted interviews. Bob didn't much care for the attention. He was just glad to be alive. His squadron mates, the ones who had toasted his memory, couldn't believe it when he walked into the officers' club 3 days after being shot down. The look on their faces was everything he'd imagined, and more. They bought him drinks all night, made him tell the story over and over, and each time he told it, Bob remembered new details. The smell of smoke in the P-51 cockpit, the sound of German voices shouting at him, the feeling of the Messerschmitt's controls in his hands, the sight of Allied lines appearing on the horizon. Within a few weeks, the war in Europe was over. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. Bob Johnson went home to Oklahoma. He married his sweetheart. He worked on his family's farm. He rarely talked about the war. When people asked if the story was true, if he really stole a German fighter, he would just smile and say it was a long time ago. But his squadron mates never forgot. The 357th Fighter Group kept the story alive. It became part of their unit history. And decades later, when aviation historians started documenting the incredible stories of World War II, Bob's story was right there at the top of the list. Here's what makes it so remarkable. Bob Johnson did something in a moment of crisis that required not just courage, but incredible quick thinking. He could have bailed out. He could have tried to crash land his P-51 in friendly territory. Instead, he saw an opportunity that probably only existed for about 60 seconds, and he took it. He landed a burning aircraft at an enemy airfield, ran across open ground under fire, climbed into a plane he'd never flown before with instruments he couldn't read, started it up, took off while being shot at, and flew it through hostile territory to safety. Any one of those things could have killed him. The P-51 could have exploded on landing. The German soldiers could have shot him before he reached the 109. The Messerschmitt could have been out of fuel. He could have crashed on takeoff because he didn't know the controls. He could have been shot down by German fighters. He could have been shot down by American fighters. He could have run out of fuel. He could have crashed on landing. A dozen different things could have gone wrong, and probably should have gone wrong, but they didn't. And that's what makes this story so extraordinary. It's not just about luck, though Bob certainly had luck on his side that day. It's about a man who refused to give up even when every reasonable option was gone. It's about quick thinking under pressure. It's about knowing when to take a risk. Bob Johnson looked at an impossible situation and found a way through it. That's the kind of thing the men and women of the greatest generation did. They faced impossible situations, and they found ways through them. They didn't have time to overthink things. They didn't have the luxury of second-guessing themselves. They saw what needed to be done, and they did it. Now, you might be wondering what happened to that Messerschmitt 109. After the war ended, it was shipped back to the United States, along with dozens of other captured German aircraft. The Army Air Force tested it extensively. They flew it against American fighters to understand its strengths and weaknesses. Eventually, it ended up in storage, and like many war relics, it was probably scrapped or sold off. A shame, really. That particular aircraft had a story worth preserving. As for Bob Johnson, he lived a long and quiet life. He passed away in the 1990s, well into his 70s. He never sought fame or recognition for what he did. He was just doing his job, he would say, just trying to get home. But the men who flew with him knew better. They knew that what Bob did required something special, something that can't be taught in flight school or learned from a manual. It required the kind of courage and resourcefulness that defines the best of that generation. I want you to think about this story for a moment. Think about being in Bob's position. Your aircraft is on fire. You're behind enemy lines. You have seconds to make a decision that will determine whether you live or die. Do you bail out and accept capture? Or do you try something so crazy, so unlikely to succeed, that it borders on suicide? Most people would take the safe option. Bob Johnson took the bold option, and that made all the difference. This is why I share these stories on this channel, because the men and women of World War II deserve to be remembered, not just as statistics or names in a history book, but as real people who faced real fear and found real courage. Bob Johnson was 24 years old when this happened. 24. Most people are at that age are just figuring out their lives. Bob was stealing German fighters and flying them through combat zones. That's the kind of thing that happened during World War II. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things because the circumstances demanded it. Here's something else to consider. Bob's decision to steal that Messerschmitt wasn't just about saving his own life. Think about what would have happened if he'd been captured. He knew details about American fighter tactics. He knew where his base was, what missions they flew, what their strengths and weaknesses were. In German hands, that information could have cost other American lives. By escaping, Bob kept that information out of enemy hands. He also denied the Germans the propaganda victory of capturing an American fighter pilot. And he brought back intelligence about that German airfield that the Allies used to plan future strikes. So his daring escape had strategic value beyond just personal survival. That's leadership. That's thinking beyond yourself, even in the worst moment of your life. The men of the 357th Fighter Group understood this. That's why they respected Bob so much. Not just because he survived, but because of how he survived and what his survival meant. I also want to talk about the Messerschmitt 109 itself for a moment, because it plays such a crucial role in this story. The 109 was Germany's primary fighter throughout World War II. It was designed in the 1930s by Willy Messerschmitt, and by 1945 it had gone through dozens of variations and improvements. The version Bob flew was likely a 109G model, which was the most common type in service at that point in the war. It had a top speed of about 400 miles per hour, which made it slightly slower than the P-51 Mustang, but more maneuverable in a dogfight. It was armed with machine guns and cannons, and it was a formidable opponent in the hands of a skilled pilot. The fact that Bob was able to start it up and fly it with no training, no manual, and no instruction is remarkable. Modern fighter aircraft have complex startup procedures that take trained pilots several minutes to complete. Even in World War II, pilots spent months learning their aircraft inside and out. Bob had maybe 2 minutes from the time he climbed into that cockpit to the time he took off, and he figured it out through pure instinct and nerve. The German engineers who designed the 109 probably never imagined it would be stolen by an American pilot and flown back to Allied lines, but that's exactly what happened. And in a strange way, it's a testament to how good the aircraft was. If it had been difficult to fly, if the controls had been too complex or unfamiliar, Bob never would have made it. But the 109 was a pilot's aeroplane. It responded well. It was honest in its handling, and that allowed Bob to fly it competently enough to survive. There's an irony there. The Germans built such a good fighter that it enabled their enemy to escape. War is full of these little ironies. Things don't always go according to plan. The best-laid strategies fall apart when they meet reality, and sometimes, just sometimes, audacity wins the day. Bob Johnson's story is one of those times. It's a reminder that in war, as in life, fortune favors the bold. Not always, not guaranteed, but often enough that it's worth taking the risk when the alternative is certain defeat. Let me tell you what happened to some of the other pilots who were shot down that same day. Bob's wingman, the man who was with him when the German fighters attacked, managed to evade and made it back to base. He was one of the people who reported Bob as missing in action. Several other pilots from the 357th were shot down over the course of that week. Most of them were captured and spent the last month of the war in German prison camps. They survived, but they didn't go home until after the German surrender. One pilot was killed when his parachute failed to open. War is cruel that way. Some men survive impossible situations. Others die in routine missions. There's no fair distribution of luck. Bob often thought about that in the years after the war. Why did he survive when so many others didn't? He never came up with a good answer. He just knew that he'd been given a gift, a second chance, and he tried to live his life in a way that honored that gift. After the war, Bob stayed in touch with several of his squadron mates. They would get together every few years, have a reunion, tell the old stories. Bob always enjoyed those reunions, not because he liked reliving the war, but because he liked remembering the men he flew with. They had shared something profound, those pilots of the 357th. They had faced death together. They had relied on each other. They had formed bonds that civilian life could never quite replicate. And they understood each other in ways that their wives and children never could. When Bob talked about stealing the Messerschmitt at those reunions, his friends would shake their heads and laugh. "You always were crazy, Bob," they'd say. And Bob would grin and reply, "Crazy enough to come home." It became a kind of inside joke among them, a way of acknowledging what they'd all been through without getting too heavy about it. Because these men didn't see themselves as heroes. They saw themselves as guys who had a job to do and did it the best they could. That's something I think we've lost in in modern culture. The idea that heroism isn't about seeking glory. It's about doing what needs to be done when it needs to be done. Bob didn't steal that Messerschmitt to become famous. He did it to survive. The fact that it became an incredible story was almost beside the point. He would have been just as happy if nobody ever heard about it, as long as he got home safe. But we're lucky that the story did get told, because it gives us a window into what that generation was made of. It shows us what people are capable of when they're pushed to their limits. And it reminds us that courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is being absolutely terrified and doing what you have to do anyway. Bob was terrified in that German fighter. His hands were shaking. His heart was racing. But he flew that airplane home because the alternative was unacceptable. I want to leave you with something to think about. Bob Johnson's story happened in April 1945, just weeks before the war in Europe ended. If he'd been shot down a month later, the war would have been over and the whole thing might never have happened. Timing matters. Context matters. Bob's incredible escape was only possible because the war was still raging, because that German airfield was still operational, because that Messerschmitt was fueled and ready. A month later, none of those pieces would have been in place. So, in a way, Bob's story is a reminder that history is made of these tiny moments, these split-second decisions, these unlikely coincidences. If any one detail had been different, the story would have ended differently, and we wouldn't be talking about it today. That's what makes history so fascinating. It's not just about the big events and the famous leaders. It's about the individual moments when ordinary people face extraordinary circumstances and somehow find a way through. So here's what I want you to do. Drop a comment below and tell me this. If you had been in Bob Johnson's position, shot down over enemy territory with your plane on fire, what would you have done? Would you have bailed out and taken your chances? Or would you have tried what Bob tried? I'm genuinely curious, because it's easy to say what we would do when we're sitting safely at home. It's a lot harder to know what we'd actually do when the bullets are flying and the plane is burning. Leave a comment. Let's talk about it. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you of why the greatest generation earned that title, then do me a favor and share this video with someone who would appreciate it. Share it with a veteran, if you know one. Share it with a young person who needs to hear about real courage. Share it with anyone who loves history. These stories matter. They need to be told and retold, so we never forget what these men and women did for us. Bob Johnson passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1994. He was surrounded by family. His obituary mentioned his service in World War II, but it didn't go into detail about the Messerschmitt incident. The local newspaper ran a small story. A few veterans organizations noted his passing, but for the most part, the world didn't take much notice. That's how it goes sometimes. The men who did the most incredible things are often the quietest about it afterward. They go back to their normal lives. They raise families, work jobs, mow lawns, and pay taxes. And only occasionally, maybe at a reunion or when a grandchild asks the right question, do they talk about what they did when they were young and the world was at war. Bob's family found his flight logs after he died. Page after page of missions, dates, times, aircraft numbers, mission objectives, all written in Bob's neat handwriting. And there, on April 17, 1945, was a short entry. P-51 shot down over Germany. Emergency landing at enemy airfield. Acquired Bf-109 and returned to Allied territory. That was it. No drama, no elaboration, just the facts. That was Bob, understated to the end. But his story lives on. It's been written about in aviation history books. It's been mentioned in documentaries. And now I'm sharing it with you, because I believe these stories matter. We live in a time when real heroism sometimes gets confused with celebrity, when courage sometimes gets confused with bravado. Bob Johnson's story reminds us what real heroism looks like. It looks like a scared young man in a burning airplane who refuses to quit. It looks like someone who sees an impossible opportunity and takes it anyway. It looks like a pilot who flies an enemy fighter through enemy territory and somehow makes it home. That's heroism. That's the legacy of the greatest generation. They didn't do what they did for praise or recognition. They did it because it needed to be done, because their country needed them, because their friends were counting on them, because giving up wasn't in their nature. So the next time you're facing a difficult decision, the next time you're scared or overwhelmed or convinced that there's no way forward, think about Bob Johnson. Think about a 24-year-old pilot climbing into a German fighter with bullets flying around him and somehow figuring out how to fly it home. If he could do that, you can handle whatever you're facing. You've got this. And if you need reminding of what courage looks like, that's what this channel is for. I'll keep bringing you these stories from World War II, stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, stories that deserve to be remembered. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring about history. And remember, the brave men and women of that generation didn't fight for fame. They fought fought so we could live in freedom. The least we can do is remember them and tell their stories. I'll see you in the next video.